Hello Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be our Legend of Korra Turf Wars Part 2 review special, where we'll be going completely through, full spoiler review of the Legend of Korra Turf Wars Part 2, the new comic that's been released. This is obviously the podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com, and I'm going to be your main host for this podcast, Morgan, Airspeed Prime, site super moderator for that site. Joining me on the podcast is just one other person, that is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So that is the full plan for today's show. It'll just be the Turf Wars review. So we're going to start off with some general thoughts on the book, and then we'll start going through it kind of groups of pages by groups of pages to cover everything we have to. So Turf Wars Part 2, written by Mike DiMartino, art by Irene Ko, colors by Vivian Ng. That's the kind of general theme for this book. So where we are right now, I think the book has been released in comic stores, but is a day or so away from the mass market release. So not everyone has read it, and I think you've definitely seen that within the fandom, where there hasn't been a ton of discussion on the book because no one has been particularly certain about when they're going to be getting their copy. That's why we've had to delay this review from being last week to this week, just so some of us could actually read it in time. But we will be doing some more thoughts next week when I suppose more of the hosts have the book, maybe a hard copy of the book and so on. It's out digitally in really good quality. But let's get into general thoughts. Overall, Greg, what are your thoughts on Part 2 of Turf Wars?
I thought it was okay. I don't think I was super blown away with it, but I think it works well as far as continuing from the first story and, sort of explaining some of the things that we were sort of expecting to happen and we're waiting to, just based off of knowing sort of like descriptions of books and just sort of like, I guess, sort of filling in the gaps. I think it does, a pretty good part of showing Korra and Asami's relationship, and, I like the parts that they have with Mako and Bola, and I think seeing that part in this episode, in this part of the book, really sort of starts fleshing it out. And I think they're starting to do something with the main villain, which I think still needs a bit more, but you can at least see where they're heading, at least with him, which I think is good.
My thoughts on this book are kind of a bit weird in that I do think it's better than Turf Wars Part 1, but I was still fairly disappointed with the book just because it's kind of like, okay, we've got a lot of the plot, getting into the villain, as you say. A lot of that stuff is developed a lot more because Korrasami isn't the only focus of this book, but it's kind of like, oh, this is all the plot is. This is the way they're going about executing on this specific plot point. I felt like they took it in kind of interesting directions, but also didn't cover a lot of them all that much. We'll obviously cover that as we go through it, about the specifics, but I think the main takeaway for me is just that I flick through the pages of this book and nothing really stands out to me. There's nothing all that exciting in this book. It feels just like it's a Korra comic, and that's it. And I feel like, why do you need to read part 2 of Turf Wars? I don't have any like individual moments where I'm like, read the book because of this specific thing, because Korrasami's not as big of a focus anymore, so I wouldn't necessarily say read the book just for Korrasami. And then none of the plot stuff I think is good enough, at least just yet, to be like, you have to read it for this. There's definitely some good character moments, but I think a lot of the plot stuff lets it down just because it's not all that notable. It's sort of the same problem North and South suffered from, of just there's some cool stuff happening with the characters, but the plot and kind of why we're doing all of this isn't the most interesting. And I think it all just adds up to the fact that like we've now kind of had like 5 books in a row where like they haven't been like, I suppose, the stuff that the fans are really, really invested in. And those 5 books happen to be like the last 2 years of comics, and so we're really looking forward to getting something big. But let's get into some other stuff. I suppose we may not have as much time to talk about the art as we go through it, so let's go overall on the art. What were your thoughts on Irene Ko and Vivian Ng's art for Part 2?
I think it was good. I mean, I don't have any sort of like major issues with it. I think, it gets across, what they're trying to go for. I still, it's very much so their style, which I think, works for what they're sort of trying to go for. They definitely, for the most part, certain scenes, they definitely have nice detail and colors. Like, on like the double page spread, that page looks pretty cool. And I think I like some of the actual frames from the end of the book more so from the beginning, just because those are more action packed. But I think it has a nice sort of flow to it and a nice sort of color to it. So I don't have any sort of like major issues with the way the book is actually sort of illustrated.
Yeah, for me the only problem is just kind of inconsistency of like kind of the structure of characters' faces, and that there are certain angles and certain characters where it just looks like that doesn't really look anything like this specific character from like a page or two ago. And to me that's kind of like the only problem, in that I actually like the kind of core aspects of like Irene Co's art, and the colors are kind of very well done. It's just I think at times the inconsistency is kind of a bigger problem than it kind of should be, I think, and especially given that the scheduling for Turf Wars is it takes much longer between books than it did with the previous creative team. It kind of feels like it's like 6, 7, almost 8 months between books. Why is inconsistency like the main problem? But overall, it's fine. It's not a big issue. It's just I think the one notable standout thing to me with the art. But yeah, she does action scenes very well, and some of the backgrounds, when there's detail in the backgrounds, it is very very well done. But yeah, let's start getting into the book. So of course, if you're listening to this podcast and you have the book, definitely read along with us as we go through this. That's probably the best way to take in this podcast. So we'll start with the kind of start of the book, which is obviously like the preview page stuff, which we've roughly talked about before. But the gist of the first couple of pages is that Korra is with Tenzin, the Air Kids, and some other airbenders, and they head into the portal to figure out basically what's the aftermath of the big action scene from the end of Turf Wars Part 1 is. And when they go in there, they find the area that was previously kind of this lush, vibrant nature environment is now looks like it's been effectively burned down or destroyed, and it's a big shock for everyone. Korra kind of obviously is very upset by this, because this is where Korra and Asami had their kind of first kind of big date together. Jinora confirms to us that the spirits were the ones who did this themselves, and Korra interprets this as like a warning to keep people away, and that the spirits still want humans in the spirit world, and so they're willing to burn down their own kind of land to do this. Some of the kind of leftover burned vines begin to attack the airbenders, and some airbending and some Korra action kind of fends them off as they escape on Ugi. So what are your thoughts on this first action scene of like basically what's up with the spirit world after part 1?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I mean, we've seen it in the preview pages, so it's not that big of a surprise, really. But, just getting to see, I guess, sort of the characters' reactions, that's probably the most sort of impact that you have on this. I mean, the action scene is very cool. I like, how they sort of illustrate it. You get to see, Korra sort of get down and do sort of like the breakdance and firebending move, which is always cool to see. But no, it's interesting just to see, our characters, I guess, in the spirit world who've never been in the spirit world before, get to see Icky's like so excited and Milo's just sort of blasé about it, and they actually get there, and it's definitely a lot different than what they thought it was going to be. So you can definitely I guess you can sort of see and feel the emotion that the characters have on seeing the spirit world.
We also get Tenzin's reaction to Korra and Asami's relationship here. With it's just a quick I'm very happy for you, by the way, and she just says thanks. I think the thing to talk about here is just that this is the one section of the book where we in any way tackle the spirit's view on the issue of the spirit portal for this book. Because after this, it's primarily the human characters kind of policing the portal, and it's not really the biggest plot point overall in this book, the portal itself. It obviously is. I think it's meant to come across as like the spirits being very hypocritical, where like they're all supportive of nature, but they're willing to destroy their own nature and land just to keep humans away. And it speaks that they have a kind of very negative view to humans, that for some reason none of the other characters seem to really consider a problem with the spirits. And I think it's slightly becoming a problem with some characters, especially the airbenders, of just they're all about we need to respect the spirits, we need to do everything we can to help the spirits, but it's just kind of like, why? What have they done for you? Like the whole history of spirits and humans is kind of like, seriously, what have you actually done? And I think that's something that we kind of do need to tackle. That, you know, even going back to like Juan's time, like humans have a reason to be annoyed at spirits because they were nearly wiped out during that era, if not for the Line Turtles, and it feels like the spirits are the ones who should be putting in more of an effort to interact with humans rather than the other way around. So, that's part of my problem with the book, and that to me the spirit portal issue is the most interesting plot point in Turf Wars, but it's relegated to this first couple of pages. I think this and the next scene is kind of all we get on it, and we don't really see a spirit character in this book to get that side of things. So, Greg, I suppose, what are your thoughts on the spirits and their actions here? Why did they do this, and what do you think it means?
Yeah, no, it definitely, I don't know, it definitely, I guess really sort of keys in on the spirit sort of point of view, is just as far as how they sort of view the humans. And then, of course, this starts the whole thing with the humans sort of reacting in kind in this, which we'll get into the next couple pages. But I don't know, it's definitely, like you said, it is like really the only, part that we really get to see any sort of involvement with the spirits. I mean, we get to see Tokuga later on, but that's sort of the human sort of spirit issue, which I don't know. I think I'm really sort of hoping, as far as the whole spirit conflict goes, since it's really not in this book at all. I mean, it pretty much has to be at least, beginning to be resolved. I mean, that's the thing. It's like how quickly can they really sort of resolve that? I mean, we haven't had too much of any interactions with the spirits, which with this being sort of, or at least what you think would be sort of the main sort of conflict here, you would think that that would be something that we would get maybe a little bit more on. I mean, I don't know. I mean, for some reason, I'm really hoping that the whole issue that they have with Tortuga, which we'll talk about near the end of the book, I don't know, for some reason I'm really hoping that that sort of issue, that conflict that they have with him, sort of being the main villain, is somehow going to be overcome with, Korra sort of working with the spirits in order to sort of, resolve that issue. Because, I mean, at least if they do something that way, there's some way to sort of, I guess sort of begin the bridge between the two or something like that, unless they're going to do something where they just decide to cut them all out of the situation altogether, which doesn't seem like what we have, thought for going for in this sort of book. So it definitely is, one of the things that seems to be taking, the back burner, in the, I guess almost in the whole series in general, other than the fact that Tortuga is now half spirit.
Yeah, it's weird because I definitely agree that they're not going to reverse this. I don't think we're going to get to a position where Korra is going to close the portals again and we just had to repeat what Juan did. I think it was meant to be a big thing, and I think it is a big thing that Korra made the decision to keep the portals open. It's just, I think how, at least given that, especially to Mike, who's writing this book, the fact that he's writing it in a way where it seems to all be human problems with the relationship, and he's not presenting the spirits as really doing anything wrong. So it feels very imbalanced, and that the plot is not human spirit conflict. It's more of like, what do humans have to do? What do humans have to change to like become friendly with humans? Rather than like, no, the spirits need to change as well, because I suppose this is where we're getting into the idea of like, is spirits, and I suppose respecting spirits, like the religion type stuff of the Avatar world, but because they're real, it doesn't really make it so that they're too much of a religious thing, especially because we're not dealing with any of the like really powerful spirits that would be like worshipped as such. So it feels like it should be much more equal, but it's not being presented that way at all. And it's definitely part one tackled it a little bit more, but I'm very worried at this point that I don't think there's time for this. I think they're probably, the best we can almost hope for is that the humans figure out what they're going to do with the spirit portal, and then it feels like we're almost back to where we were before, where it's just like, yeah, they sort of get on okay, rather than actually tackling any big issue with it. But we will move on with the book. After that, they come out and they immediately notice another problem, and that is that General Iroh, under the orders of Raikou, is moving in the United Forces military to surround the spirit portal. So they put up like metal barricades, and they have airships in the air, tanks on the ground, guarding the area around the spirit portal. Korra obviously is not happy with this, brings it up with Iroh that this is the last thing we need here, like military outside the portal, and it's making the spirits even worse. The airbenders try to argue as well, but Iroh says, these are orders, I have to go to keep to these orders, you have to talk to Raikou about this. And Korra immediately storms off to go and deal with Raikou. So what are your thoughts on this scene with Iroh on the outside here?
Yeah, another Raikou move that just upsets everybody all over again. I mean, yeah, it definitely seems like, I mean, I don't know, it doesn't seem like, the spirits are, provoking anything sort of like outwardly, but, I guess, basic sort of human reaction is to try to sort of like control the situation. So you can see, I guess you can see where they're sort of coming from, even though it definitely doesn't seem like the right sort of thing. Like, you would think that he would sort of, go to the airbenders, since, they have been involved with the spirits before, rather than, taking basically a military action against them, even if it isn't, directly sort of opposing them. Is still, it seems, rather aggressive. I mean, you get to see the whole sort of like what they do, the ka-chunk of, the metal walls being sort of built up around it, which is pretty interesting how they're going about it. So, it almost sort of reminds you to sort of the series where they had it in the north. So, yeah, no, it's definitely interesting to see, how they're going about all of this.
Mm. And it's an interesting one, because I think when we knew Turf Wars was going to be about the spirit portal to a degree, we all talked about like, well, what they should do, and I think we all more or less agreed that like they're going to have to do something with it, because this is a portal right there next to like one of the biggest cities in the world, like the capital of the entire world, basically. Can you just let it be open? Spirits can come in and out, humans can go in and out. There has to be something done with regards to like policing it, or limiting what can come in and out. Obviously, what Raikou does here, very overly aggressive, of like, okay, they put a barricade up, but then they also have like almost a complete army surrounding the portal. Like, that's very, very aggressive, and obviously it leans into the idea of he has no idea how to handle spirit stuff at all, seemingly. So, interesting stuff here, and I like that they present Iroh of like he at least considers what the others are saying, but in the end comes to the conclusion of just like, I have to stick to my orders, I can't just go against people. But you get the sense that he more or less agrees with them, but he has to take orders from his superiors, and I like that they're not vilifying Iroh here, that Korra realizes that it is Raikou's problem, not Iroh's. So that's that. From there, we cut to Mako and Bolin, with Lin basically giving a report about what happened at the end of Turf Wars Part 1. Bolin wrote up the report, of course, because Mako's hand is injured, and basically he went overboard with the report and put in all these extra details that weren't necessarily needed, including the stuff about Korra and Asami kissing. And her reaction is basically just like, oh yeah, what do you know? She's just like, okay, that's interesting, and that's her reaction to it completely. She complains about Bolin's handwriting, and then Mako reports also that Korra thinks that Wanyang Kum may be involved, that he may have hired the attack on the airbenders at the portal, and that they may need to investigate him. And the result that we get is basically just that Lin doesn't want them to investigate Wanyang Kum because he's so powerful within the city. It would look bad for the police to investigate someone with that much power, and so it feels like they're sort of at a dead end, and they feel that, oh, the only way to go from here will be to get some information from Two-Toed Ping, when they mention they need to go and visit their 12-toed friend. So what are your thoughts on this scene with Lin here?
Yeah, no, I think I don't know, it's cool to see our first sort of, real sort of interaction of like just sort of Bolin being in police officer and doing the report. And I know it's funny how the fact that he, I guess overdid the report. I don't know. It makes me sort of think back to his sort of like his mover days and whatnot, which we get to see a little bit of that more so later on in the book. So it's fun just sort of seeing, I guess, sort of their initial dynamic here working with Lin. So no, I think it's interesting just to see sort of how they're, going about this case, and us knowing sort of like what's happened up with Wang Yang-kum, and just sort of that whole situation. Is interesting to see them, I guess, sort of work out through this whole sort of situation here.
Mm-hmm. So next we visit Ping in prison. He was, of course, captured in the early stages of Turf Wars Part 1, so that's why he's in prison here. And the core of this is that they kind of want to get any information that Ping, as a Triple Threat member, has about the new leader, Tokuga. And the result is just that he doesn't really, tell them all that much, and they sort of eventually get to the kind of point where they think that the only way to get information is going to be by dealing with kind of informants here, but not too much to really talk about here. Do you have any thoughts on this kind of quick scene with Ping?
I don't know. I think it's just fun just seeing the brothers sort of interact with Ping in general, just because they have like such a history, and now they're just, Ping is still on the bad side and their brothers are both on the good side, but they still sort of like remember when they used to be involved with them. So I don't know. I think that dynamic is just interesting, just seeing them acting on the good side, and I guess sort of using that knowledge to help them out in their current sort of place in the world.
So we move on from here. We'll bring up some triple threat stuff later on. Next, we cut over to Asami and Zhu Li, who are overseeing construction work on the new kind of houses, kind of apartments that are being built. Pretty cool that we see earth and metal benders involved in the construction, which I think is something we kind of suspected was a thing that they used to kind of make construction go quicker. We also see that they're using the Dragonbird hummingbird suits with the welders as well, so that's cool kind of continuity. And they say that if everything goes on schedule, they should be able to move in the first group of evacuees in a few months. So the construction is going to take a few months before they can give people these kind of houses or apartments. At which point Raikou and his campaign manager is going to they show up, and the gist of what happens here is that Raikou doesn't know what to say to the people when they ask, how quickly will we be able to move in, and the campaign manager speaks for Raikou and says, guaranteed end of the month you'll be able to move in, and they're all happy because they've been told this kind of very quick information. But this is all just to get more support for Raikou, because the campaign manager reveals that the new kind of apartment blocks, the houses, are going to be called the Raikou Residencies, and they're all very impressed. He's taking the kind of all the applause for this, when this was all Asami and Zhu Li from Part 1, if we remember correctly. He didn't have a clue what to do, and they were the ones pushing for, like, building some new stuff and asking for the funds for it. That this is something that he had to do, and they had to, if I remember correctly, they had to like almost force Raikou to give them the funds. Like, we don't care if the city doesn't have the money, this is a required thing for the city. And so they're all annoyed that he's making these promises that he can't keep. And I think there's a point earlier on where he more or less kind of refers to Zhu Li and Asami as the ones kind of running most of this stuff. So if any of the promises he makes don't go right, blame these two, not me, type thing. So you can sort of see him playing the political game here of blaming everyone except himself. But what are your thoughts on this first section here before Korra arrives? So Raikou and Asami, Zhu Li.
Yeah, no, just Raikou again being his, self that no one really likes. I mean, it's so, I don't know, you really just, I guess you can see how they're sort of setting him up to take the fall, or, just sort of just be able to sort of pass the blame onto Zhu Li and Asami here. Is just, it's just such a sort of contrast, and just his campaign manager is just, he's pretty much just where he's just like your typical sort of like campaign type person that you see. So you can really see just sort of how much Raikou's just working in all the politics here.
And I think the thing we're still wondering after the end of this part is just like how much of this and the way they're presenting Raikou is Raikou himself, and how much of this is going to be that this is the campaign manager doing all of this, because
Hmm.
we've noted that it's been, even more so than the show, they've been very much leaning into like Raikou is doing underhanded things. He's laying the blame on other people and is being very, very unlikable as a character. Part of it, I think, is him, but I have a feeling this new campaign manager guy is probably going to be the one who ends up potentially taking most of the heat for what Raikou has done when in terms of trying to explain Raikou's actions. But what are your thoughts on how much of it is one or the other?
Yeah, no, that is a interesting theory there, and I could definitely see the blame, later on coming down to sort of his campaign manager. But I don't know. I guess with Raikou being the one who is the current sort of president, and sort of he is sort of agreeing to it. It still would have a lot of blame on him, especially sort of like when he's talking to people here. He's definitely sort of trying to hold face, I guess, in the situation of everything going on. And even later on, we can see how more so he's trying to sort of push off the blame. I think probably more so with sort of like the Avatar stuff than anything else. He's really where he's sort of trying to put, most of the blame himself, versus all the stuff where he's sort of trying to, I guess, sort of help the city seems to be the stuff that the campaign manager is more sort of trying to put sort of a good face forward to. So it's definitely sort of split. I mean, I guess I sort of wonder, later on what might later come of the campaign manager, just because we get to see him a bit here, so it makes me wonder just sort of like what things holds for his character in the future, or if he really is just sort of like a minor character that just has some role in here.
Yes, but Korra and Tenzin arrive, and Korra just walks straight by the campaign manager, who tries to stop her. She immediately gets in Raikou's face, basically saying, the portal is sacred land, Raikou, you can't turn it into a military base. Tenzin orders him to call off to United Forces, and he says that he won't. And they note that you're dealing with a spirit crisis here. Who's going to vote for you then? If this spirit crisis really kicks off. And he counters this by saying, we wouldn't have a crisis if you hadn't created that portal in the first place. She points out that I didn't exactly do it on purpose. Kavira's spirit weapon was out of control. I had to save the city. And he says, and in doing so, you destroyed these poor people's homes. Entire neighborhoods were leveled in the blink of an eye. And then he brings up the fact that, when all this was going on, Korra went on vacation to the spirit world while this was happening. And immediately turns the fact that, hey, Korra saved the city to, no, she assisted in like the destruction of your homes and then went on a vacation. And this kind of turns the people against her, that she did all this stuff. And he then finishes off by saying, because of your recklessness and selfishness, these people's lives have been shattered, and as usual, I'm left to deal with the consequences. And they just kind of point, Asami and Tenzin point out that you have some nerve for such a coward. When Republic City needs a true leader, Korra stepped up. And that, if not for Korra, they would be dealing with like a dictatorship now, with Kuvira in charge, because obviously he didn't particularly handle that stuff well as well. And this is an interesting one, because I think Raikou's point about the vacation is actually fairly valid, in that she did save the city, but left everyone else kind of to deal with the immediate aftermath when she went on vacation. Not to say that she didn't earn a break, but it is a valid point. But I think he ruins it immediately by basically having such a weird view on Korra, and it's been his view on Korra since like he's been introduced, of like he complains when she doesn't do anything, and then complains when she does something. So what is she meant to do with regards to Raikou? Of like, she's either too involved or not involved at all. In that he's saying, you getting involved in the incident saved the city, but it destroyed everything. And it's just like, what would have happened if she didn't do this versus what happened if she did? So it's obviously Raikou playing the politics game of turning everyone against Korra, everyone except him, basically. But it's interesting, but it just makes him very unlikable. Even though he brings up a somewhat valid point, he's so unlikable in these last couple of pages. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, he definitely is very unlikable in this sort of situation here. And yeah, it really is just him sort of playing the politics here, and just sort of, turning everyone, against Korra, again after everything good that she's done. And he definitely, he has a way with words which is just, typical of politicians. He's just able to sort of, slide the people onto his side despite, everything that Korra has done, which, it would have been, completely worse off if she hadn't sort of intervened in any sort of form or fashion here. So it's really, it really sort of, sucks to see sort of Korra sort of get down on this and sort of have to sort of like just basically sort of succumb to sort of this, bashing that he's sort of giving her at this point here, which, definitely, I'm sure this sort of thing probably won't help him sort of later on. And yeah, I definitely can't see the whole point of him sort of bringing up the vacation, because you typically would think that you would, at least sort of start the rebuild and then sort of take a break and then sort of come back to sort of finish it. So I guess you could say the timing is pretty odd, but, it's really just in the way that he sort of words it that makes it seem so much worse than it probably really is. I mean, we don't, it's not like it's been a huge amount of time or anything like that. So it's really just him sort of just posturing to sort of get in a better position with the people here. So it's definitely, this is the part where it's really, you can see him sort of, be in the bad light sort of directly, even if, everything else is sort of going on around him.
Yeah, and then the other implication, of course, is that like it doesn't seem like Raikou has specifically done anything to help in the aftermath, and that so far like Zhu Li and Asami have been the only ones doing anything like actively to help out. But we move on, and this is obviously the kind of moment we've been waiting for here, where Asami brings up that like someone needs to put Raikou in his place, and she says, Tenzin, you should run for president. You'd win it in a landslide because everyone hates Raikou. He just says, oh, my days of politics in United Republic are over. But there is someone else much more capable of leading United Republic, Zhu Li, and she's shocked. And Korra and Asami are actually all for it. Asami says, if you were able to keep up with all of Varric's ridiculous demands, leading Republic City will seem easy. And she says, it's an intriguing proposal. I've been so focused on the evacuee crisis, it hadn't crossed my mind. And Tenzin says that that's exactly why you would make a good leader, because of her compassion and caring about others. And Korra's basically just like, it would be nice to have a president that she could see eye to eye with and not just argue with all the time. And she says, I'll take it under advisement, and she's kind of considering what to do about this. She does say that they need to get back to the camp. The new shipment of food and supplies is coming in from Ba Sing Se. And she needs to make sure it gets dispersed in a timely fashion. And then Asami just makes the point of, if she was elected as president, she would be President Moon, and that has a really nice ring to it, which is a really good point, actually. I like that little line at the end there. But yeah, this is what we've been waiting for, Zhu Li becoming president. How would it happen? And I like that they bring up that Tenzin actually has a history in politics, basically, because he was on the council. And that he can see that, no, look, Zhu Li would make a very, very good president candidate because of, obviously, his kind of view as like an airbender, in that she's compassionate, but also we can see that she's directly organizing much more stuff than Raikou is, and so on, and that obviously she must help Varric organize his company to a degree, and now she's helping with this kind of refugee, kind of evacuee crisis stuff. So it seems like it's all working out well for her. It's just going to see like she's stepping into politics for the first time. How exactly will this work? But what are your thoughts on this as the way they brought Zhu Li into the president race?
Yeah, no, I thought that was really good how they sort of, just sort of almost sort of offhandedly sort of brought it up, and then they all sort of just, agreed with it. And, Zhu Li, I like that she's sort of, she's thinking about it. It's not something, she's not the type of character to just sort of jump into things. I mean, she can sort of like react to things, pretty fast, and definitely can sort of like handle herself, which, everyone can see. So, it's really cool to see them all sort of, say their sort of like their point of view of why she would be such a good president, and just sort of, like you said, the last line that Asami has, I think it's definitely really cool just to see how this, sort of starts to begin to play out. And even later on when we get to see a bit more of it with Varric, I think it's very nice how they do the whole sort of coming into the president race rather than, her sort of coming at it directly from, sort of political angle. She really just sort of wants to help the people, which, doesn't always make sort of the best sort of president, but at least you can, have someone that has an understanding of the actual people, and then hopefully they can sort of build into all the presidential stuff.
hmm and next we go into our first, I suppose, proper Korrasami scene here. They walk into Asami's office, and Korra breaks the news to Asami that the field, the part of the spirit world they went to, is now a wasteland. And Korra says, "When you and I stepped through that portal, I thought my life was finally changing for the better. But now that we're back, it feels like nothing's any different. Raikou's still impossible to deal with. The city's still a mess, and now people are starting to turn on me again." And Asami says that I know one thing that's different, that's definitely different, and it's obviously the relationship between the two of them. As it looks like another kiss is about to happen as they get closer together, Asami says, "There are always going to be problems to deal with, but as long as we stick together, we'll be able to overcome anything." And just as they're about to kiss, it looks like Korra kind of walks off and says, "I know you have a lot of work to do, I'll let you get back to it." And Asami sighs. Obviously Korra still very upset at what Raikou said to her and the people turning on her from before. Interesting scene. I like that we're kind of seeing them sort of talk about this, but potentially a sense of Asami trying too hard to say the right thing instead of maybe addressing the specifics of this situation and maybe how Korra can turn it around. But it's still nice to get some scenes with the two of them together and not just maybe drop it after the part one stuff. It's interesting enough, but I'm definitely still waiting for a little bit more of a kind of angle on where exactly they're going with the Korra and Asami relationship with regards to how the two of them interact together and like the development that's going on here. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, no, I think it's a nice sort of, I guess, sort of at least a start to actually see sort of how the relationship works with each other and sort of, how Sami is, trying to be supportive of everything that's sort of happening here. And, you get to see a bit more of it later on. I think they have they have at least a nice sort of balance of a start to see sort of how they support each other here. And, it's just, you can see how much, everything is sort of affecting, Korra in this part, which is why, they don't, finish this sort of nice moment that they had here. And you can see, even when, Korra's leaving, how they don't even show her eyes just to show, I guess, sort of how, how upset she is with, the whole situation with Raikou. So, I guess the fact that it can affect her in this much is definitely sort of like a telling thing here. And it'll be interesting just to see, with everything that happens eventually in this book, which is a good amount between the two of them. And, we don't exactly know how it's going to end up with the sort of cliffhanger at the end. It'll definitely be, I don't know, I'm pretty sure they'll definitely show, more of the relationship and how it's actually going to work later on. So I think this is, at least a sort of good start to that, even if it isn't sort of like the main focus of this book versus the last one.
We cut over to Mako and Bolin's investigation, and we get Bolin basically giving the kind of the narration as he kind of almost sees what they're doing here as a bit of a kind of a police mover going on here, a police movie. And he talks about how Republic City, a metropolis in turmoil, like a wild moose line, crime runs rampant. Innocent citizens go about their days, oblivious to the fact that a shadowy force threatens their very existence, and the city's only hope lies with two brothers, both on a search for justice and themselves. And Mako is not particularly happy about Bolin's speech here, but Bolin wants to kind of do like, there could be a movie, it could be called Mako and Bolin on the Beat, or Good Cop, Bad Cop. And he kind of wonders, would Bolin be the good cop or the bad cop? And he's like, no, I'd definitely be the good cop. And, and he says to Mako, I don't think you'd be good enough to play against type, suggesting that Mako would obviously be the bad cop here. And then Mako brings up the fact that, neither are you. Do you think being Nook was a stretch? Which is a pretty nice little jab at Bolin of that, like, yeah, in a way, Nook was this kind of highly exaggerated kind of version of Bolin's kind of key character traits, and he's like, hey, that role had a lot of range, and then basically he brings up the fact that are you still kind of cranky because both your ex-girlfriends are dating each other now? And Mako's reaction is, what? No, why would I have a problem with that? I think it's great that Korra and Asami are together, And Bolin just says, "You don't seem so cool with it," as they notice a new character that we've not seen in a while. But we'll get to that in a second. What are your thoughts on this, initial section of Mako and Bolin out on patrol?
I think it's definitely a fun scene. I mean, anytime you have sort of Bolin sort of with his brother, it's definitely sort of interesting. And the whole sort of like narration of the mover and sort of how they do the frames, they definitely set it up like this could definitely be sort of like, like a TV episode of a buddy cop type show that they have going on here, which, they sort of have just with their dynamic that they have with each other and their relationship. So I think it definitely works that way. And, the brothers, they always, play off each other well. And, I like the fact that Bolin sort of brings up the whole relationship thing, and Mako, even if he's not sort of super cool with it, at least he's sort of, I guess he's trying to sort of get over it with this, typical of Mako. It takes him a little bit to get over these type of things. So I think they're definitely sort of working this pretty well.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm happy about here is that they seem to be more playing with the fact that kind of, I suppose, a more natural reaction from Mako of just like, yeah, this would be a little bit of a thing to get your head around, that this kind of relationship has suddenly happened, and like, where does that leave his kind of friendship dynamic with the two of them, and it's going to take a bit of a time, rather than having him be like very conflicted about it or anything like that. It seems like it's more of a jokey thing where like he'll probably need to have at some point like a conversation where he talks to the two of them about it, and then after that it'll be cool of it, probably like the two of them acknowledging that why it would be a somewhat uncomfortable situation for him, as well as him kind of wanting to be happy for the two of them. That's kind of what I'm hoping for, and I think we may get it towards the end. But where do you think they're heading with the fact that they are leaning a little bit into the fact that Mako is taking a bit of a time to get used to this, whereas everyone else is just kind of like, oh, they're together, okay.
I think that is an interesting question. I mean, I don't know. I guess it'll really be sort of telling when we first see them sort of all interact with each other. If Mako's sort of back to his, I guess, previous during the show where he was, kind of a bit sort of awkward and was being sort of like real like official policeman. I mean, it doesn't seem like he's quite gonna be that way, at least from what we see so far. He doesn't seem like he's too sort of like awkward about it. But yeah, no, I definitely could see a conversation happen, but I don't think it'll be anything sort of as serious as we had before. I think Mako's sort of matured a bit past that, other than his normal sort of character awkwardness that he has.
Yeah. I think a more personal scene between Mako, Korra, and Asami is probably needed. Just because like we haven't got a lot of Mako and Asami scenes in the. I can't remember really the last time they had like an individual scene together, and stuff like that. But the character that they spot here is Scuchie, back from book 1. So we haven't seen this guy in a while. So they have to age him up, obviously, from a younger character now into a teenager. So they know that's who they're kind of looking for. The gang of kind of teens that he's with says, coppers, everyone split, and they all run off. And Bolin is the one to kind of immediately jump straight into action to chase after Scuchie. He says that he just wants to talk. He does some earthbending in the alleyways, but Scuchie kind of jumps over it. And Mako somehow appears on the other side of the earth wall and immediately kind of catches Scuchie. Obviously, these are his like experienced police officer kind of tactics of knowing the streets really well and escape paths and so on. So he kind of catches Scuchie as Bolin shows up, and basically the idea here is Scuchie isn't really willing to kind of admit to anything. He doesn't really want to speak to them all that much. He kind of says that, I've been living the straight and narrow these days, and Mako brings up, why do you have such nice clothes on? And he says, oh, I found them. And it's Bolin who surprisingly is the one to get quite aggressive in this situation, and he screams at Scuchie and says, quit lying, answer Mako's question. And Mako has to calm Bolin down, and in a really nice moment for Mako, he kind of understands the position that Scuchie is in, because it's basically identical to the situation Mako and Bolin were when they were in or around Scuchie's age here. He says, "Listen, I was in your shoes once, thinking the triple threats was my only chance to make something of myself. I know you're just looking out for number one, but there comes a time where you have to grow up and realize you have responsibility to help others." And this does help Scuchie to kind of speak a bit. And he says, "Last I heard, the triple threats were holed up in an abandoned warehouse at the docks, Pier 31." And he says what seems to be his catch line, I guess, as a character. But you didn't hear that from me, as he runs off. And it's a little joke at the end of this scene where Bolin is like, "Hey, I lost my cool, bro. Sorry, I guess I am the bad cop. You are the good cop. Who would have thought it?" And Mako's just like, "Yeah, let's just go find Tokuga." So I think this is definitely one of the more kind of highlight scenes from the book, because there's good interaction between Mako and Bolin. You get to see a little bit of a different side to Bolin in this job, as well as the side of Mako that's sort of been forgotten a little bit in the last couple of seasons of the show. So I was pretty impressed with this, as well as obviously the return of a character we haven't seen in a while. It was a pretty good appearance from him. So I think this is definitely, I think, for me, one of the highlight scenes from the book, and I really enjoyed how they went about this, in that Mako getting a good moment that isn't just an action moment. That's something pretty rare in the last while. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this scene with Scuchie?
Yeah, I guess that is kind of rare to get to see sort of Mako have more of a sort of a heart-to-heart conversation with a character that isn't his brother. So it's definitely, nice to sort of see, I guess sort of, that range that, Mako can have as well as Bolin can have in this situation here. But no, it's a nice sort of quick little chase scene to sort of catch, Scuchie, who definitely looks like they've done a good job with sort of his character design for making him a bit sort of older here. So no, I think it's definitely a nice set of frames, just sort of getting to see the brothers interact with Scuchie here and just sort of get the information that they needed in the situation, despite how that turns out in the end eventually.
Yeah, the other thing they mention here is that they mentioned to Scuchie how dangerous Tokuga is, that people die when he's around. So kind of a little bit of a setup for the character. But next scene is we see Asami in her office, and who walks in but Jargala and some of the other Creeping Crystal Triad members, and they have a talk here. They sort of threaten Asami somewhat clearly, somewhat subtly, about what if the construction project you're overseeing, it'd be unfortunate if you weren't able to complete it. And they basically Jargala kind of acknowledges that Asami, a powerful, what you say, quality women in the city. We could use more of them, right? And she seems to respect her to a degree, and offers the protection of the Creeping Crystals in exchange for a small monthly fee. And Asami kind of takes out the shock glove at this point, defending herself, and orders them to kind of leave, and they do. But there's the idea that Jargala, when she leaves, says, "Obviously Miss Sato isn't thinking straight. Let's give her a couple of days to reconsider my generous offer." And they leave, and Asami's a bit stressed out in the aftermath of this scene, having to defend herself like this. This is an interesting scene in that I think it's meant to suggest something about Asami's character, that she tries to do stuff on her own too much, and maybe I'm really confused with this scene, just because I'm not really sure what role we're really meant to see the Creeping Crystals as playing, because they're set up as like the only real opposition to the triple threats, because they more or less established that all the other triads have been like incorporated into the triple threats. So this is meant to be the second biggest triad in the city. And then, while still I think acknowledging that they're criminals, I'm kind of like, are they trying to somewhat kind of lighten the mood with Jargala here by kind of her somewhat offering Asami protection, in that she maybe knows something's going to happen here? I'm probably reading too much into it, but it's definitely a scene that probably will be maybe more important later on, when we maybe discover the exact details of how exactly Asami was kidnapped. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's I don't know. There's definitely something behind it for sure, but I don't know. I mean, really, I guess it was more so just a sort of I don't know. I was thinking of it more along the lines of just showing, Asami's sort of character of her, just sort of, after everything with her father and everything, not wanting to work at all with any people with any sort of like questionable intent, and yes, she does definitely sort of try to do a lot of things on her own, but we do see later on that she at least does get sort of some security, even if she won't sort of take extra help from Korra. But I don't know, it's definitely an interesting sort of conversation in general, just to get to see, more of, I guess, just the creeping crystals rather than what we've seen them before, and get, I guess, a little bit of a character on their leader here, and sort of how they might sort of, I guess, sort of be involved in this, sort of conflict that they have in the city later on. I mean, I don't know, it's definitely interesting because we haven't sort of, I don't know, I just sort of wonder if they even, I mean, they are, yeah, sort of like the second biggest sort of gang in Republic City, but, with everything that Tortuga sort of eventually does later on, are they really that much of a threat overall? I mean, yeah, to the city in general, but I don't know, I don't see how that plays into the turf war, quite as well, at least at this point in time, even though that is, the name of the book, but, turf war could be, any sort of type of thing, how they sort of played out in the end. So it's definitely interesting to see, this sort of aspect come into play, which I think it definitely, does have a place. This is, sort of a typical thing that we would sort of see. So I wonder if, this sort of gang might sort of come to sort of like Zhu Li or Raikou as far as sort of having any other sort of political means, or sort of trying to work any other sort of backhanded deals into this whole sort of situation, which, in Raikou's case could lead to his downfall. So I don't know. There's definitely a bunch of different ways it could go about sort of using the creeping crystals.
Mm. Yeah, I'm sort of wondering, like, are they maybe setting them up to be maybe a slightly more honorable triad than some of the other ones? Because come the end of this series, I can't really see any way where you can like keep the triple threats like alive as a group. Like, it feels like whatever way Tokuga and the triple threats are defeated, that kind of has to be the end of the triple threats, unless they're going to like have all the triads kind of come back, like the Agni Kais, Red Monsoons, and so on. It feels like the creeping crystals will probably be left as like the only triad in the city, but they're not as big of a problem maybe as other triads, because like we didn't really hear about them before this series, so they may stay for the most part under the radar and do things in a somewhat okay manner while still being criminals. I'm not particularly sure, but we'll move on. So we cut over to basically what looks like the triple threat hideout, and we get introduced to this kind of older member of the triple threat called Zen, Zhen, and they're doing some gambling here, and they kind of talk about what happened to Tokuga, that Spirit really did a number on him. He doesn't even look human nowadays. He's a freak. And then Zen says, Tokuga got what was coming to him, if you ask me. And he then talks about how, like, under his leadership, they're actually losing ground rather than gaining ground, and that the creeping crystals are kind of gaining on them. And that they bring up, I think Shady Shin here mentions that Tokuga's working on a big score, and that he thinks he'll come through for them. And Zen actually brings up some interesting history in the triple threats here. If you believe that, then you're more naive than I thought, old friend. And he brings up the point that their previous leaders, Lightning Bolt Zolt and Viper, that while still being criminals, they always had the backs of their other gang members, and that he doesn't really feel that way about Tokuga. And we mentioned that, what do we get mentioned here? Yeah, he mentions here that Viper is dead, which is obviously like a kind of continuity error. But at the same time, I'm like, is it? Because I'm kind of confused now about the whole Viper thing. I suppose we'll quickly stop here to discuss this, but Greg, what's your thoughts on the whole Viper thing, given what they did with Viper in part one?
Yeah, that is something I noticed that I'm like, I guess, but I don't know. It's definitely weird the way that they sort of set that up there. So I don't know. I guess it's one of those things that sort of it could play out to actually sort of make sense later on. I don't know.
Yeah, because the reason I'm kind of saying like, oh, it's a continuity error here is because Turf Wars Part 1. What is it? Page 34. Yeah, page 34. Tokuga and the Creeping Crystals, or the Triple Threats and the Creeping Crystals, are having a fight. The police interrupt this fight and arrest Ping, which is why he's in prison. And they also show Viper running away and getting arrested as well. But then, like, is it later on in the book, they explain, it's Ping in prison, isn't it, that explains basically the history of who Tokuga is in the first place. And the explanation that we get is that he came in, bumped off Viper, already suggesting that Viper has been killed, and then this book completely confirms it to us. But he's just been captured and we know he's alive. Like, Ping was literally with Viper in like the previous scene before he was captured. And then the only way this works is if Viper somehow escaped from prison and was killed off screen by Tokuga, which I don't think is meant to be what actually happened. So I think they've made a mess of who Viper actually is, and they've probably, I think, made two identical characters and have arrested one of them who's in prison, and they probably see as like a no-name character, and then Viper, the previous leader of the Triple Threats, is just dead now, even though they're both the exact same person. So fairly bad continuity error in that I don't think we've ever really had something like this in Avatar, where look, they've just completely mistakenly done something with a character. It's not that big of a deal in that we just now have a kind of no-name Triple Threat member who looks like Viper in prison, and the actual Viper is dead, but it's never an ideal thing to have a continuity error like this in play. But thematically, it's meant to kind of suggest, obviously, that Tokuga doesn't really care about his gang members as much as the previous leaders did. But what are your thoughts overall on this kind of first couple of scenes with Zen here giving us some insight into the Triple Threats?
Yeah, no, I think that's probably the most interesting part, just sort of getting, better sort of understanding, of just the triple threats and sort of how they were sort of being rolled, and sort of how, I don't know, just sort of the fact that they have this sort of, such a sort of a cliched sort of type of thing, but, it works as sort of just an element as far as just, giving us sort of a narration dump on sort of how things have been going and just sort of setting up what happens later on. So, I think for what they're trying to go for here, I guess it sort of works, even if it is kind of typical to happen.
So they mentioned the other name here. It's Mushi, who is this where the confusion comes in, that Viper and Mushi are actually different people? I'm quite confused, because otherwise I would think like Mushi would be the Earthbender guy that was with
That's
Viper.
That's what I would think, yeah.
So to me, the error to correct then is that you have Mushi, the Earthbender guy in green, be the one arrested in part 1. Now, I don't know if they'll do it, but that feels like something they probably should try to correct for the hardcover collection when it comes out. Of just like, you've made a little error here. It's not too important, but you probably should try and fix that. But we'll see if they even acknowledge it or anything like that. But anyway, we move on. So Zen is talking, and then Tokuga arrives in with his new kind of dragon tentacle arm thing, and basically grabs Zen around the neck, slams him through the gambling table, and tells him to sit down. And he says, take a good look, everyone. This is the new face of your leader, so you better get used to it, because I'm not going anywhere. At this point, we see Beifong, Mako, and Bolin, and some other cops going up on where they feel the Triple Threats are actually hiding out at the pier, as Scuchie said earlier on. And we get this narration of Tokuga saying, "That spirit intended to kill me. Instead, I've become stronger, quicker, and the changes are more than just physical. My mind is sharper and clearer than it's ever been. You could say I've had an awakening. I've seen beyond my initial vision for the Triple Threats. I realized my plan was too small and far too limiting," as we see Lin using her kind of seismic sense to sense anything inside. and she says, that she's picked up at least a dozen people on the lower level. Get ready to move in. As they kind of move in, he says that fighting with the creeping crystals over a few city blocks isn't worth the time and effort, and serving as someone else's muscle is beneath us. From now on, we call the shots. My new aim is for the triple threats to seize control of Republic City and become the most dominant triad in history. We will possess enormous financial and military power, and he says that he's made an arrangement with Wanyang-kun to become our new benefactor, so our money problem is solved, and then they're going to get the tanks, airships, and mecha suits from Kuvira's failed invasion, which he says is in a depot outside the city. So that's kind of the gist of their plan. It's an interesting one for sure. What are your thoughts on what Tokuga says here about his kind of spirit morphing and the new plan for the triple threats?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is where we see him become sort of like a real like sort of classic type villain with higher aspirations, which is of course to go and take over the city, and then of course to just keep going as far as he can go here. So I don't know, I think it's it's interesting that this was all sort of brought on by the spirit sort of awakening or encounter that he had here. Like it didn't it definitely didn't seem like this would be sort of like your typical normal progression that you would have. But yeah, no, I mean it's almost like it's the spirit's fault that they're in this sort of predicament in the first place, which is why we definitely hope that is somehow part of, at least I hope that's somehow part of the actual solution that they have later on. I mean, I think the way that they actually go about doing this in the book is really cool, how they have it sort of overlaying on top of this other sort of situation that's sort of happening, and it almost makes you think sort of like they're actually in the right place, but of course that doesn't typically happen by the end of it. But no, I think it's definitely a nice sort of setup that they have here. I mean, it seems, I don't know, I guess it's interesting just how they decided to describe sort of how his ascension has become and how he's sort of describing it to all of the other triple threats here. But I don't know, it's definitely something to take note of, just how he's becoming your typical sort of baddie, I guess.
Yeah, like I appreciate them giving us an explanation for what his aim is, but I don't think it's particularly unique or interesting. It's just, he basically says like, we're gonna be a better triad, and even though he says we're not just gonna be a better triad, that's effectively what he's still trying to do, and that he still just wants the triad to take over the city. And I'm just kind of like, was that not the aim in the first place? Like, if you won the gang turf wars, would that not be exactly what you had in the first place? You'd have money, you'd have the power, you'd have control over the city. I suppose the idea here is that, as we see him, making a move against the police, is that they're not just going to be the criminal gang that don't really try and overthrow the police, and now they're probably going to try and do that. That's the kind of bigger goal, and that they're actually attacking the police here. But the main, I think, unique thing here is definitely that, okay, money from Wanyang-kun, and then I think the really new thing that I don't think we expected was that he's going to use the kind of, I suppose, decommissioned kind of military kind of equipment from Kuvira's army. That's the new angle on this. That's going to make them more than just a random gang of street thugs that any notable bender could defeat. That's what makes them a threat. But it's still, I don't think, all that interesting, because it still presents the same problem, which I think we'll get to later on. But it's interesting enough. It's just, I'd hoped for a bit more from the villain, and I still don't feel like we know him all that well. And then as for the explanation of his powers, I still kind of want a bit more of an explanation, in that, okay, the spirit tried to kill him, but instead it improved him. But like, why is that even a thing, is kind of what I want to know. Like, why does a spirit going into a human's body change the human physically? And in this case, why does it make his mind better? Why does it make him physically stronger? I think I want more of a like technical explanation of why exactly this has happened, because prior to this it felt like Yao, who's the other one who was spirit morphed, It felt like he was made almost useless as a character because he was turned into like part 3. They didn't present him being part 3 as like any sort of a benefit whatsoever. It could be the specific spirit that did it to Tokuga here being more powerful, but it still feels like something where like there must be something more to his spirit morphing here than we actually know about. But do you have any specific thoughts on that? Why they went with just a net benefit for him having undergone this outside of his appearance not going well with other people?
Yeah, I don't know. That is tough. I mean, I don't know the sort of physical aspects of being morphed. I mean, I definitely could see how that would sort of make you, I guess, better even if you are sort of disfigured as far as like your properties, if depending on what spirit you're actually involved with. I mean, we have seen one other sort of spirit morph with Aiwei. So I mean, but that guy, he's sort of like freaked out, so we don't know sort of what came of him later on if he was able to sort of cope with his abilities. I mean, I don't know, maybe the fact that Tortuga is sort of like your bad type villain, he's able to sort of I guess overcome the difficulties that you would have normally associated with this sort of morphing. I mean, it still doesn't explain the whole sort of like his, sort of like intelligence and stuff sort of being sort of increased with this. That part still seems a bit sort of, I don't know, a bit sort of iffy. I mean, I guess I could see, I could see that sort of happening. It just seems, I don't know, maybe just because we just don't have any sort of real sort of precedent for before, it just sort of seems odd to us that that would automatically, sort of improve you. I mean, sure, we can see that sort of with the Avatar, but it doesn't necessarily make her any sort of smarter that we can sort of tell. It just makes her, physically more enhanced, which, you can see that in Tortuga as well. So it definitely does seem a bit sort of odd that this is sort of a real sort of thing that has sort of like awakened him, because it doesn't seem like he was like sort of like a spiritual character at all or anything like that. I mean, not that he was exactly sort of like dumb to begin with. I mean, being able to do, being able to sort of even begin to sort of start taping over sort of the gangs and the triads in the city, you definitely have to have, some sort of level head, even if it's sort of like an evil level head on you, in order to begin that sort of process. So I don't know. It definitely seems a bit sort of iffy that it was able to take him this far, and that he's now, basically going to, attack the whole city and just basically take it over by force. And then, who knows, where he might sort of go after that, if he actually is able to sort of achieve that. So it definitely seems like he's gotten a really a good benefit out of this whole sort of thing, which I guess maybe is just sort of to put him on sort of like a more level playing field with, who he actually has to go against.
Yeah, and the other thing to bring in here is the part 3 description, which gives us some details. It says, now teeming with dark spirits influenced by the half-spirit, half-human Tokuga. That's interesting that they're really going in for the idea that he's half-human, half-spirit now, in that I suppose that may end up being like physically he's half-spirit, half-human, because when you just say half-spirit, half-human, that's to me like Avatar stuff, where like Korra actually has like a spirit Rava in her and herself, so Korra as like a being is kind of like half human, half spirit, as opposed to Tokuga, who just has half of his spirit, half of his features are now like kind of physically represent the what a spirit looks like. But they're going with the idea that this is seemingly allows him to influence spirits. So, is this going to lean into the idea that because he's been somewhat, I suppose, like touched by a spirit, it's kind of awakened him spiritually, and because I suppose some of his physicality is now in part due to spirituality, is sort of like influenced by a spirit, it allows him to sort of do some level of what Korra can do when she's in the spirit world, where because she's half human, half spirit, basically, she can influence the spirit world around her. And in like book 2, it basically got to the point where she can turn spirits light or dark depending on her mood. Is that what they're going for here, to get to that point of like someone who's spirit morphed can use it if they have enough power to influence spirits? I don't know. What would be your interpretation of that, given that part 3 directly says he's kind of half spirit, half human, and that he can influence spirits?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely seems like he's now actually, in some form, actually sort of a spirit and can sort of influence them, which I don't know, it definitely seems like it's a bit of a sort of a jump from what we know. I mean, I don't know, maybe he has some sort of spiritual element to him already, which allows him to sort of tap into that. I mean, I don't know, unless he's just sort of, I don't know, because they say dark spirit, so it makes it seem like he's really sort of directly influencing them rather than he's sort of like, I don't know, somehow able to sort of coerce them to actually sort of work with him. I mean, I don't know, I think it'll be interesting to see, I guess, sort of what spirits are actually sort of with him or which ones he can actually sort of influence, if it's, like more so like low level spirits versus ones that we would, typically think are stronger. So I don't know. It's definitely sort of a hard thing to wrap around because it's just we don't know any of the spiritual sort of aspects that he really has. I mean, yeah, physically, like you said, he definitely has, the aspects of, the spirit that he was interacting with, but, beyond that, it doesn't seem like that's something that a trait that you typically would sort of just pick up. It seems like something that you have to be learned or taught somehow.
Yeah, because this might lean into, like, this maybe explains maybe some of the spirit's actions, where, like, if they're aware of the fact that humans who are spiritual can influence them to the point where they can go light or dark, maybe that's part of the reason why they're so unwilling to maybe stay around when conflict happens in case they turn dark. I think that would be an interesting angle to take on it, where like the spirits are somewhat afraid of like their almost inability to control their transformation from light into dark, and that it's like an influence humans have over them. Whether or not they go into depth like that, but it's those sort of details. Any details on kind of like how spirits work in relation to humans is something we need. But we move on. So Tokuga continues to explain more of the plan here. He says, soon the police, the President Raikou, even the Avatar, they will all answer to me. But in order for us to evolve, the old regime must die. And the first to go will be Chief Beifong and her Triad task force. As we see, Mako, Bolin, Beifong, and some officers go into the Triple Threat Triad, hideout. But when they go in, they find out that it's just basically mannequins with clothes on and masks, and they immediately realize it's a trap. Mako rips his bandages off his arm. As an explosion happens, they all run away. Mako faces the fire and basically firebends a kind of path so that I suppose he creates like a tunnel free of the fire, which stops the kind of, I suppose, backlash from the fire from hurting anyone. And it's a pretty cool moment for Mako. Is like Bolin's running away terrified, and he's like worried about Mako, but Mako just stands his ground and stops the fire from getting through the doorway. And in the aftermath of this, it seems like his arm is still sore, even though he did this kind of firebending move. But it seems like it's on the way to healing. And they apologize for their kind of leading them into a trap. But they realize, Mako and Bolin both realize that the only path now is to investigate Wanyang Kum. And Mako says, I don't care what she said, Tokuga almost killed us. If Wanyang knows something, then he's our only shot for tracking down Tokuga. So even against Beifong's orders, they're going to investigate Wanyang Kum because that's the only chance now, and it's kind of personal now that they've nearly been killed. So Greg, what are your thoughts on this sequence here?
Yeah, no, this is definitely, it's definitely a harrowing situation that we see them sort of in here. I definitely like the whole sort of like double page spread that they have here with, Mako sort of, firebending the flames in the explosion sort of way. It's nice to, it's always nice to see Mako sort of get like a standout moment in these books here. So it's definitely one of my sort of favorite scenes just in general, just because of how they sort of like designed it and laid out. But yeah, no, it definitely shows that, they thought they were really sort of in the right sort of place here, but it definitely looks like Tokuga, however he has been sort of, enhanced, I'm sure Scuchie probably didn't know that he had sort of bad information, but, clearly someone else was sort of thinking ahead and setting up this sort of situation here. So yeah, no, this is now they know the only person that they really can go to for information, and it'll just have to play out from there.
Mm-hmm. So we cut temporarily back to Tokuga, and basically he just says that victory will only come through unity, and he's managed to convince them all to get on board with his new plan, including Zen, who he's still holding up by the neck. And he says, "Good, now prove it. I have an important job for you." And he's going to send them out on a mission that's important to what they need to do, which we obviously know by the end of the book. That's realistically, it's obviously to kidnap Asami and maybe organize getting Wanyang Kum where they need him to be, or they already have him where he needs to be. But anyway, we go to what seems to be the headquarters of Wanyang Kum's corporation, and they go in and ask the receptionist to talk to him, and she basically just says, "If you don't have an appointment, I can't help." And they're kind of ushered out, but then the kind of two people there say, "Actually, can we ask you a question?" And he says, "Is Mr. Kum in some kind of trouble?" And they both look at each other and come clean. "Mr. Kum hasn't shown up for work the past couple of days. We haven't informed his employees yet. We don't want to alarm anyone. Your boss has been missing for 2 days and you don't think to call the police?" And they say, "Mr. Coombs a private man and doesn't like to involve the authorities, so we've been investigating on our own. We've checked his home, but his wife hasn't seen him either." And they immediately realize that Tokuga must have done something here. So this is where they finally realize, I suppose, that Korra was completely right about this, that there is some sort of a Tokuga Wanyang Kum connection, and that he's kind of been out of action since this has happened. So any thoughts on this scene?
Not too much. I think it's just interesting just to see sort of how they sort of set this up. Just the fact that, he is private, so I guess it wouldn't be such an odd thing that he wouldn't be seen, but, with him being gone for this long, I guess it's definitely sort of setting up. But no, I think it's interesting just to see this sort of workplace and where his company is sort of run from, and I guess, I don't know, it doesn't seem like he's very private, so maybe he's not sort of like super shady, but he definitely, he is sort of like, I guess, a recluse type character, which I guess is why they don't immediately think something's wrong. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting setup here.
Mm-hmm. After this, Korra heads off to the construction site to talk to Asami, but there's a security officer outside, and we get a moment where Korra says, "Can I just see my girlfriend, please?" Which I know a lot of Korrasami fans were very happy to kind of get that line and just see them directly calling each other girlfriends. Asami says, "You can let her in." And inside, Korra immediately asks, "What's with the hired muscle? Just a precaution." And Korra says, "Tokuga set a trap for Beifong and the task force, nearly blew them all up, but they all made it out in one piece, thank goodness." And Asami reveals, "I had a small scare last night, too, but nothing like that. A few Triad thugs showed up and threatened me unless I paid them off." Korra gets quite concerned. "What, are you okay?" And she says, "Fine, please don't make a big deal out of it." And Korra's like, "The triple threats are out of control." And she says, "It wasn't them, it was some woman named Jargala, leader of the Creeping Crystals." And Korra's ready to go fight for Asami here and says, "You don't need all this security. I'll pay this Jargala lady a visit, and I promise she'll never bother you again." And Asami just says, "I said don't make a big deal out of this, I can handle this myself." And she says, "But I want to help you." And Asami says, "I don't need your help." And Korra kind of goes off and says, "Okay, fine." So we'll, I suppose, talk about it up to now because they kind of sort of resolve it in the next part. But I think it's an interesting scene to get across that potentially this is maybe the flaw of Asami we've kind of been looking for, to maybe add an extra layer to their relationship, in that that was a pretty serious kind of confrontation Asami had last night, and she's sort of making light of it, and that, okay, she's hired some guards, but she's almost looked past the fact that they offered her protection because the triple threats are kind of, in a way, preparing for some sort of an attack that may involve Asami. And especially with what Korra just said here about what nearly happened to Mako and Bolin, you can see the idea that maybe Asami is maybe overestimating how much she can handle on her own, and not wanting to make such a big deal about it is sort of an issue, in that she probably does need more help here than she realizes. But I'm not really sure if that I'm reading into that too much, or if that's what they're actually trying to present here. But what are your thoughts on this scene here, and specifically them very much presenting Asami as like kind of wanting to do this on her own, protect herself?
Yeah, it's weird because I mean it's definitely with what happens with Mako and Bolin, you would think that she might take it just a little bit more serious. I mean, I guess the situation on its own, I guess for being in this sort of position, maybe Asami has sort of seen this sort of type of thing happen in business before, which hence at least she did get some sort of protection. But I guess you could kind of see when they sort of explain it later on why she doesn't want to go so far as what Korra sort of suggests here, but it definitely seems like she may be not taking this up to sort of the type of level it is. But again, Asami doesn't know sort of the whole sort of scope of things, so that might also be sort of like a factor in as well. I mean, she thinks it's just sort of the Cuban crystals, not that there's this whole other thing going along with Tortuga that could sort of affect her as well. So you kind of can see it and kind of can't see it as far as her sort of taking almost everything sort of into consideration here, which maybe is something that if Korra or Mako or Bolin sort of explained more to her, maybe she might have taken it maybe a bit more serious than it actually is.
So in the next scene, they sort of resolve it. Korra's quite annoyed, obviously, that kind of Asami has dismissed her help, but she says, Korra, I didn't mean it like that. It's just, I don't want you to feel like you have to be on avatar duty every time I have a little problem. And Korra says, I'm not doing it out of duty. I care about you, Asami, more than I've ever cared about anyone. If anything happens to you, ... And Asami says, it won't. I've got this, as they kind of hug. And then basically they organize a date for that night they say, how about 8 o'clock at Fawn's Dumplings, maybe a romantic turtle duck boat ride afterwards. And Korra says that it sounds perfect. So this also might present somewhat of the kind of problem here of like, yeah, once again, Asami maybe thinking that she can handle this too much herself, not wanting to maybe rely on other people as much, maybe kind of wanting to be maybe overly dependent, not rely on her friends too much, because I think it is maybe a factor of her character at this point that all of her family is gone. It's just kind of her and then the people that she's friends with, and maybe not having that like direct family support network is maybe why she feels that she needs to be very independent all the time. The other factor here might be that because Korra is the avatar, she may not feel that like wanting to ask someone who's so close to her, who is as powerful as Korra is, for help, and there might be somewhat of a factor of her kind of wanting to prove that she can look after herself, in the fact that no one ever needs to look after Korra because she's the avatar, but me as like the non-bender, why do I need to be looked after, especially by the avatar? Again, maybe that's reading too much into it. Maybe it is a minor factor of it that Korra is just that much stronger than the Sami, and that might be an angle on it. But still, I think a very nice scene to see the two of them just communicating so well like this, and going from a little bit of an argument into organizing a date. But what's your thoughts on this page?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely is a nice way that they sort of resolve the situation that they have here. And yeah, I think there might be some more sort of underlining things that, could happen in this, because of this sort of situation here. And I think it's definitely something, with what everything that sort of happens in this book, they'll definitely, have to have, I guess, at least one more sort of conversation like this, because, with everything that sort of happens, it definitely, seems like Asami's just, just with her, her just growing up in her situation and everything that's sort of happening around her, it definitely seems like she definitely is sort of, somewhat pushing things sort of all on her own. But no, I think the scene is definitely very nice.
Mm-hmm. Next, we cut over to the kind of evacuee refugee camp, and we see the amount of like tents that are kind of set up, and like this is the kind of state of where people are in while they wait for the apartments to be built. And they're wondering where the food is. This is obviously the food delivery that Zhu Li mentioned was coming soon a while ago, and all she can say is that I don't know. Just please be patient. The supply should be here soon. I hope. The crowd are beginning to get very annoyed about this, and Varric reveals that they've gone through his whole supply of Varric cakes except one, and he eats the last one here. We also see that Kaya and Tenzin are also here, and they kind of talk about this. Zhu Li mentions that it's Raikou's fault we're in this mess. He assured me that those supplies from Boston Say would sail through customs. I swear he's holding things up just to spite me. Um, and they're all like, "Wow, that's unconscionable, even for him." And he says, "This morning, Raikou was acting like he had the evacuees' best interest at heart. What a hypocrite! He wants to help people when it suits his needs." As what happens here is that Varric ushers Zhu Li into their kind of tent to talk about things and that she might need. He says a massage might be in order here, and she's just like, "Okay, yeah, I think I need a break." So we'll talk about these 2 pages before we get into the Varric Zhu Li conversation. But I think it's interesting that they're going very far here with this. Like this, if Raikou is actually slowing down, like, supply aid food basically for these evacuees, that's just a almost villainous level move if he's trying to do this to gain some sort of advantage in the presidential race. The other interesting factor here is just that he doesn't know that Zhu Li's running against him yet, but obviously maybe has some suspicions that it might be her. So him slowing it down, like, it doesn't really solve anything unless we jump into part 3 and then, like, his campaign manager announces just like, "Oh, like, President Raikou, like, personally went to the port to get the food and bring it to you here," and it makes him look really good, rather than, I suppose, the way it would usually work is just that the food gets to, like, Zhu Li and the camp in general, and she helps to give it out, and it's just a matter of, like, who actually gives it out to the evacuees or whatever. But I could see this being one of those things where, like, it's blamed on Raikou, but it might be the campaign manager with some sort of a plan, and maybe this is the final straw for Raikou with his campaign manager. Like, why would you do that to the people, hold it back like that? Because to me, that's the only option. Because if you commit to having Raikou having made that's like this like, there's no way he can win the presidential race. But what are your thoughts on these 2 pages?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely something to note. I don't know. I think regardless of how they play it out, they definitely, they won't say Raikou sort of directly was sort of holding it back. I mean, even if his campaign manager does do it, I could see him not sort of figuring out, or, just sort of, I don't know, maybe not sort of turning a real sort of blind eye to it, but just sort of, taking just sort of all the credit of actually sort of bringing the food to the people, or at least letting it through, or, maybe setting up his own sort of thing where he's actually sort of directly involved with them once he sort of figures out that Zhu Li is sort of, working against him in the presidential race here. But yeah, it's definitely sort of, upsetting to see how this is all sort of set up, just sort of with, all the people sort of waiting for the food here. And I don't know, it's definitely sort of a interesting situation that they're sort of trying to angle this whole sort of, political aspect, and how they're sort of setting up sort of Zhu Li to sort of go against him. But no, it's definitely an interesting couple pages, and just to see, Zarek and his typical sort of antics that he has here, even though he does have a nicer moment later on.
So they go into the tent, and obviously Varric mentioned the massage, and when they get in there, he expects Zhu Li to give him the massage, but she quickly points this out and is just like, okay, we'll switch this around, and he begins to give her a kind of back neck massage, and she brings up the point of, what would you think of me running for president? And he kind of has a bit of a shocked reaction, then immediately goes, "Love it." And she's like, "Really? Korrasami and Tenzin encouraged me to run against Raikou, but what if I end up losing to that imbecile? I don't know if I could handle it." And he says, "You won't lose." And she says, "But if I win, suddenly all the problems plaguing the United Republic become my problems. I don't know if I can handle that either." And he says, "Zhu Li, you are the most tenacious, brilliant, inspiring woman I know. The people love you. If you really want this, Raikou doesn't stand a chance." And this inspires her enough to say that, "You're right, I'm in." And he says, "Woohoo, this calls for a celebration," as he kind of lifts her up here, and then quickly puts her back down. So this is another one of the my kind of favorite scenes in the book, just because it's one of those relationships where, like, okay, they got married at the end of the show, but we didn't like really see a scene of them talking like after they got married, and so this is like the first real like husband-wife conversation between the two of them, and I thought it went really well, because obviously like they're presenting Zhu Li as much more of a character now, very different than her like initial book 2-3 portrayal, continuing more on the line of her book 4 portrayal. And I really like that how much more episodes equally they're being presented here, whereas like I think before Varric tended to maybe like overshadow a lot of their scenes together. Here it feels much more interesting in that like Zhu Li is now like the focus character of kind of these two more so than anything. So I think it's a really cool scene to get her on board with this, and her like express why she's concerned about fully committing to doing it. That, you know, it'd be awful if she lost to someone like Raikou, given the way he's acting. But if she wins, there's all this other pressure on her that she doesn't know she could handle. But, you know, like the other characters are saying, Varric chimes in as well and says that, you know, I think you can do it as well. So I was very impressed with this scene. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, I think this scene is definitely really good, just to get to see their dynamic here, and how much, the relationship has, changed over time, and to see, Varric be the one that's supporting Zhu Li in this situation here, and that, sort of give her the confidence to do this sort of situation, which, it definitely, seems like this is, despite all the sort of like hardships that are happening, that Zhu Li definitely can handle this, just being the president with everything else that she has done in the past. So no, I think it's definitely a nice scene that they have here.
Mm-hmm. We cut over to the restaurant where Korra and Asami organized their date, and we see Asami in her really nice clothes as well as her glider, and we see that what looks like, how much time is this? Like 15 minutes passes, and obviously past the time they initially planned, or longer actually. Because they said they'd meet at 8, and it goes from being 8:15 to being 8:30, and then at that point she decides that she's got to go, something's up. She rushes over to the phone and calls Mako at the police station, and says to meet for him and Bolin to meet her at Asami's new office, because something's up, because usually there's no way Asami would stand Korra up like this. So they arrive at the office and find that it's a mess, basically. The guards that Asami had hired are all beaten up. There's rocks all over the place. The whole room is almost like cracked in half. And they can't really talk or explain what happened, just that they came out of nowhere. Korra immediately assumes that it's the creeping crystals, because she had just heard about that they were the ones who threatened Asami before. But Mako kind of has his doubts about, how do you know for sure it was them, because you can't be fully for sure. So they get into the police car, and the three of them head off to find Asami. And they initially do this by going to the Creeping Crystal hideout, but we'll cover that in just a second. I think the obvious thing here that they almost forgot about is that Book 4 established that Korra can just connect to like the spirit vines throughout the city to locate anyone whenever she wants, and especially someone like Asami. Like, should she not just be able to do that? There should be no like problem here, because they never really seem to put any sort of like a limit on it, where like she could just like, oh, only if you're really close to the spirit wilds or anything like that. It doesn't feel like she's like so far away where like that just is an impossibility or anything like that. So it's a bit of a weird one. Maybe it is just a restriction where like the spirit vines are too far away where she is, but a few people mentioned that, and I think, yeah, that's a power you established, that like it wasn't anything specifically at the time that was allowing Korra to do this. She just did it and found people. So she should be able to do it again. But other than that, I think it's an interesting scene of her like just knowing that Asami didn't show up, so something is up here. This is kind of protective Korra jumping into action here, that what they talked about just before kind of came to pass, and Asami's missing now. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, no, I don't know. I guess it is interesting. I don't know. I guess I almost sort of think that it's sort of like in this sort of situation type thing that, Korra sort of didn't even think about using this sort of ability. It definitely seems odd that maybe someone else sort of wouldn't have mentioned it to her, and that would have like sort of calmed Korra down for a second, and then she would have used this to figure out, where Asami really is. Or even if she couldn't like directly locate her, know that she just isn't, with the creeping crystals or something like that. But I don't know. It's, Korra is sort of the type of character that sometimes does just jump into things sort of head first. And with this being Asami, I guess you could kind of see why she might sort of overlook this sort of thing. And I don't know, I guess, with all the rocks there, I guess it sort of, leads to you thinking that the creeping crystals could be involved in this sort of kidnapping here and with everything else. But no, I think it's definitely, I don't know, I think it's interesting just sort of how they show the passage of time and how the beginning scenes of the day. It definitely looks like those pages are really nicely done. So I really like how they did that. And it's too bad the day didn't turn out how it actually was supposed to.
Hmm. So they arrived at Creeping Crystal's headquarters. Really cool the way they have most of their lighting done as like the green crystals that we know of from like the catacombs of Ba Sing Se and so on. So we see the return of those crystals, and that's what they fire at Korra the second she bursts down their door. She blocks them though, and then just like wrecks the place basically with them. Immediately confronts Jargala, the leader, and asks where Asami is, and she says, she's very kind of calm with this whole situation. She says, I'm telling you, she's not here. Don't believe me? Take a look around. And we kind of cut away from it there, but they obviously don't find her here. Anything you want to add about this one?
No, not much. I think it's like you mentioned. It's really cool seeing the catacomb crystals again and how that sort of works with this gang. I think that's really a nice touch. I mean, just the fact that the page has the whole sort of like green sort of hue to it, I think is pretty cool here.
Yeah, I suppose on the creeping crystals, do you think like Jargala has some sort of a special bending technique with the crystals or something like that? That's why she's the leader. I feel like they're almost setting her up for something because she plays a pretty notable role in this book. So I think we may see some sort of a special attack that she has or something like that.
I wouldn't be too surprised. I mean, that seems like that would be like the cool thing to go. I guess the question is just really is how does she actually use that? Like, does she use that like I guess sort of for her advantage or not, or for the good or the bad side? I mean, I guess maybe we might have seen that before since they were in sort of a messy sort of situation before, but maybe that just wasn't sort of right time, or maybe they just didn't have the right sort of setup for it. So I don't know. It definitely could be interesting. It definitely she seems like an interesting character, and I know a lot of people do sort of like her introduction, so it should be cool to see how they use her.
So we cut over to Air Temple Island next and see the family at dinner basically discussing what's going on with the spirit portal. Jinora mentions that the United Forces have no right to occupy the land around the portal. Iki says, yeah, now the spirits won't ever want to come back, and I don't blame them. I'd stay away too if there were a bunch of mean benders and tanks and metal walls where I lived. Tenzin says Raikou's decision doesn't sit well with me either, girls. But Korra and I spoke with him, and he's made up his mind. The good news is Zhu Li has decided to run for president, but in the meantime, I'm not sure what the best course of action is. Pema says, I'm sure it will play itself out sooner or later. Sooner or later, Raikou will realize it's impractical to keep the United Forces there permanently. On this page, I think the only issue I'd potentially have is just what Iki's saying, just kind of being I don't blame them too. I'd stay away too if there were a bunch of mean benders and so on. I suppose just in general, I think the airbenders' reaction to the spirits is a bit I kind of want a deeper explanation of why you're being bending over backwards to accommodate the spirits, and what the exact reasoning for it is, given that they haven't exactly helped you guys out either. In that, do not take any offense at all to the fact that the spirits didn't help when the whole Kuvira conflict was going on, and that Iki's basically saying that Republic City is the home of certain spirits, but they left the second it was under attack and so on. So there's some issues going on here. The result of this is that Jinora says we need to do something now if there's any chance of the spirits returning. Milo, obviously the more kind of military focused member of the Airbenders for some reason, mentions we should get all the Airbenders together and march on the portal. And Tenzin's actually that's actually not a bad idea, Milo. The Airbenders could lead a peaceful protest march. It could rally the city behind us and prepare Raikou and pressure Raikou to withdraw the troops. And they all seem pretty excited about this, except Milo, who says, I meant we should get all the Airbenders together and attack. But sure, we can do your idea first. So fun stuff with the Airbenders once again. Interesting to see kind of an older Jinora in the kind of standard kind of Airbender gear and not the wingsuit. Just that, okay, they don't wear that all the time. When they're just at home, they wear the standard Airbender stuff. That's kind of costume wise, outfit wise, design stuff is nice to see. But what are your thoughts on this bit here with the Air family?
Yeah, no, that is interesting though. Although Tenzin does have his air suit on, it looks like, so that is interesting. But no, I think it's a nice just to see, I guess, them sort of all sitting back together again after everything that sort of has happened here. We even get one little bit of Rohan being fed by Penma, so it definitely is nice to see how their I don't know, their point of view on the spirits. I mean, I don't know. It seems like it's one of those things where certain people only sort of see one point of view from how they view the spirits, and I don't know, maybe the airbenders would just always be sort of on the side of that the spirits are in the right and the people are in the wrong. I mean, it seems kind of odd with everything that sort of has happened, but maybe that's just sort of our perspective looking onto it from sort of the outside versus being sort of involved in it. I don't know, it just seems kind of odd that their viewpoint hasn't changed, or there hasn't been any sort of I guess sort of questioning to the relationship that they actually have here. I mean, maybe just because the airbenders relationship is always so good with the spirits that they don't necessarily see sort of the conflict of interest that everyone else has. I don't know, it's definitely an odd sort of situation here, and it'll definitely be interesting to see how this peaceful, march that they have on the portal actually goes over, because that just seems like something that probably isn't going to work out in the end, and maybe there'll wind up being a battle anyway, which of course is what Milo wants. So it definitely is a interesting sort of setup that they have.
Yeah, because I think the problem here is just like, to an average person in the Avatar world, bender or non-bender, any nation, what reason is there to really care about the spirits? Because it doesn't seem like knowledge about the spirits is like particularly well known. Now, it could have been a bit more prevalent in like the 3 years since like the portal's been open and people have maybe interacted with spirits a bit more. But it's still a case of like, they're very much like, the spirits are like this legendary group of beings that we need to respect, and like we need to do everything to accommodate them. And it feels like the airbenders are almost treating the spirits as like special, instead of just they're kind of equals, they're just from like a different world type thing. That it feels like maybe some people are not respecting them enough, and then the airbenders are almost like over respecting them, when the spirits are giving humans like basically no respect. And it feels like it's ignoring basically the history of humans and spirits in this whole thing, which is why I think potentially, unless part 3 does a lot to fix this, the lack of any sort of like spirit character talking throughout most of this book, I think will end up being an issue here, and that we're not being presented with their side of things at all, because I think we're at the point now where we're just asking like the questions of like, what do the spirits even want? Why do they care about living in the physical world and so on? Why do they want to live there? And just like, what are they about, and so on? That we need to get that question of like, why should the spirits be respected as such? Like, what reason have they been given? And I suppose the question that I don't think anyone's asked is just like, what about the spirits respecting humans? Like, who's fighting that argument, that side of things? But we'll have to see where it goes. I don't have too much confidence that they'll tackle this topic in part 3 in the way I think needs to be tackled. But Greg, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think we'll get more focus on the spirits themselves?
I don't know. That's definitely a tough one. Just with the whole situation that they have with Tortuga, I don't know if we're gonna have sort of the heart to heart that you're sort of thinking that we really need to have in this situation. I mean, I think for me, my goal is to sort of just to hope that they actually have the spirit sort of intervene at all in the situation, just to have even the spirit, the dragon spirit or whatever that sort of cause Tortuga to change, to actually sort of be involved with the resolution. I think that would go a long way to at least sort of start the conversation that they have to have with sort of the spirits and their relationship with the humans here. Just that in general. I mean, I don't know. I mean, let's say, Zhu Li does become the new president and everything, would she be open to having a dialogue with the spirits? I mean, it's definitely something that I could see happening, but with everything else that's going on, I mean, I don't know how sort of high up on the priority list that would actually be.
Definitely. And then I suppose the other thing is just that it's also sort of unbalanced, the idea of like the spirits don't want anybody coming into the spirit world, and that they're even annoyed when Korra goes in there. Yet it feels like they just want to be allowed into the physical world whenever they want, and it's definitely just a case of it not being treated particularly equally on both sides. But from there we move into them leaving the Creeping Crystal's headquarters, and Mako reveals to Korra that she was right about the fact that Wanyang-kun is missing and now Asami, and then we get the idea that they obviously try to piece things together at this point and figure out that, okay, Wanyang-kun missing, Asami missing, must be the same people, must be Tokuga as well. But then Mako gets a report over the radio that says that they need all available task force members at the police depot because there's under attack by the triple threats. So this is obviously the Kuvira's kind of army equipment. So they head down there, and already the triple threat members have taken command of a lot of the tanks and the mecha suits, and they're doing a lot of damage here, and the metal benders are struggling to deal with like a full-on military organization here. Tokuga's on the scene as well, at which point Korra, Mako, and Bolin also arrive, and this is where they see him as a half spirit for the first time and are shocked. And he once again says, "You turned me into this." She does counter it by saying, "I didn't mean for that to happen. I was trying to stop the spirit." And he brings up the idea that I guess you should have tried harder. Your actions have consequences, Avatar. It's time you learned that. And he says, "What's that supposed to mean? You'll find out soon enough." So this is where obviously the action towards the end of the book properly steps into play. But what are your thoughts on this couple of pages?
Yeah, I think this is definitely a nice setup for this whole sort of battle that they're, just about to start here. I mean, just the fact that how they sort of, give you sort of, I guess, the overview of how they took over the depot and how they're sort of, they already have gotten everything and they're sort of coming out of this, and just, it just shows you, it just reminds you, I guess, of the overwhelming force that, Kuvira had when she was attacking the city. I mean, I guess you would have thought that maybe they would have had this in a more sort of secure place, but maybe this, really was the most secure place, and then they just, I guess with Tortuga and his sort of enhanced abilities that he has now, that he's able to just sort of, take over sort of everything without too much effort. So no, it's definitely a pretty dire situation that they're starting off here.
Yeah, I don't know where they're going with the whole actions and consequences thing, because Raikou basically mentioned the same thing to her before with regards to like creating the spirit portal, and now he's mentioning it here. And I think the problem is that like they're both situations where it's very difficult to feel that like Korra is really in any way to blame as such for any of these things happening. In that, okay, she's sort of involved, but especially the Tokuga thing, like she really had no real involvement with the spirit attacking him. That was all on him. He and the triple threats attacked the portal. He was clearly the one instigating it and doing most of the damage. A spirit attacked him, and that's what happened. And while, yeah, they showed Korra trying to stop that spirit and then being distracted by Asami being in trouble, it's still a case of, like, he got himself into this mess, and it's not really her fault that this happened at all. So that's another, I think, factor in just the dynamic between these two, of just, like, he blames her for this, but she has really no involvement in the fact that this has happened, and it feels a bit weird that they're still focusing on that. But anyway, next, Mako says, "You're the one who needs to answer for your actions, not Korra." who sent you to the portal to attack the airbenders? Was it Wan Yong Kum? Are you stealing all these weapons for him? And he says, no one kind of owns me anymore. Kum works for me now. And Mako says, where is he? And it's revealed that they have him up on one of the airships that they've captured, and he's captured by the triple threats. This is when he mentions the fact that the three of them right there in front of him, they're outnumbered, outmatched, and they basically counter with the fact that this is Team Avatar you're dealing with. Yeah, you have more people, but I don't think this is as big of a problem as you think it is. And this is where he brings up, not the whole team. Aren't you missing a fourth member? And this is where Korra gets incensed and screams. Whereas Asami, she starts to fight off with airbending. He dodges. He slices at her. She jumps over it. And she, I suppose, usually would be able to land this firebending kind of blow, but he blocks it with his kind of arm tentacle, being able to move the way he does, and kind of slams her into the ground. Mako and Bolin are quickly taken out by the mecha tanks with the electricity, and just as it seems like they're just about to be defeated, Korra decides to use the Avatar state. But this is where he brings up the fact that, if you do this, then Miss Sato dies, and we see our friend from before holding on to Asami up on the blimp with a fire dagger to her neck. She's chained up, and Korra says that this is all my fault as Tokuga attacks the city, saying it's time to lay claim to our turf. Interesting finale here of just like, okay, Wan Yong Kum, almost a non-entity in the book, even though they note that his money is important. The core of this, though, is definitely Asami and the fact that she's captured, and here's Korra trying to get her back. Most of this has obviously happened is to take the Avatar state out of play. That the only way any opponent can really counter Korra, unless they themselves are like approaching that level of power, is to give Korra a reason why she can't go into the Avatar state or can't fight them at this moment in time, and that's keeping Asami hostage, is to kind of keep Korra's Avatar state powers away from things. It's interesting, obviously, because we see how protective Korra is of Asami throughout this book. It's just, I don't feel it's the most interesting cliffhanger, for one, because they spoiled it like months ago in the solicitations, but two, because I think it's so obvious that nothing overly serious is going to happen to Asami. So it feels like it's just a matter of time before Asami breaks out, or Korra, they come up with some plan to get her out. And especially with like trying to create something around Korra of her saying this is all my fault, I'm just like, how? Like I can't even think of a way where like Korra can really consider this to be her fault, in that you can maybe say it's partly Asami's fault for not taking help from Korra from before, but Korra's fault? Like, how? Maybe it's part of the character arc that they're trying to have all these characters kind of not quite manipulate her, but kind of mold things in a way where it seems like Korra's at fault, but it's a little bit kind of hard to take what exactly they're trying to present here. But what are your thoughts on the last section of the book?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess, with Korra, she usually feels that things are somehow being influenced by her. And I mean, I guess even she's not sort of like, I mean, she is sort of involved in the situation, and, to some degree, she has been involved in these sort of actions here, even if, Tortuga being sort of directly influenced with the spirit wasn't like her direct doing or anything. But I don't know. I guess it definitely seems like, like most people who are sort of against Korra, they're trying to sort of, manipulate her into sort of thinking, through their lines and through their sort of reasoning, rather than, how Korra or how other people see it, which is, one of the things that sort of Korra has to just, I guess, sort of deal with in general, just with her character traits. So it's definitely, something that she'll have to sort of work out. But it's definitely, I don't know. I mean, I guess, it's sort of, I guess I sort of see your point of it sort of not being sort of like the most sort of like dangerous sort of thing. I mean, it definitely is sort of pretty threatening. And, from Korra's perspective, it definitely seems like, she's at a loss of, at least directly what she can do, just because her her normal sort of response to, sort of dealing with these things, which is pretty physical, won't, exactly work in this sort of situation. But, definitely can see that this probably sort of won't turn out the way that, Tortuga definitely sort of thinks it will be. I mean, there's definitely, they'll have some sort of plan or whatever. And I don't know, they definitely make it seem, pretty threatening, I guess, from Korra's perspective of just Asami sort of being up on the blimp, being held, sort of captive, and, Tortuga just about to sort of, lay waste, in theory, to the city, which, you got to think that there's still, some other force out, not force, but, just there'll be some resistance. Like, not everyone will exactly sort of roll over, and even if he does have all this might, I don't know, I don't see the triple threats being that sort of big of a group just on their own that they can sort of just muscle over the whole city, despite the tanks and the mechs that they have now. So it definitely seems like there's definitely going to be a lot more that has to happen for them to sort of achieve what they're sort of going for, which I guess is just one of those things that we're just going to have to wait. But it's definitely setting something up. It's just how is it going to go about, and what way they go about it. It just seems, I don't know, it seems a bit sort of up there where how it's going to actually play out.
Yeah, like from the part 3 description, we know that obviously we go into the spirit world at some point, because obviously that's where we're going to see the spirits turn dark. And I think the description also basically says that kind of Korra has to go into the spirit world to get Asami back. Which the question obviously then is, how did they get into the spirit world? Because the United Forces army is there. So does Iroh suffer another military defeat here? Because I think that's a fairly even fight, because it seemed like a pretty substantial force they have around the portal. So there's going to be another fight outside the portal. Somehow Tokuga and at least a couple of people get in. I don't know how the Airbender March gets into this, because it almost feels like the march is immediately cancelled just because this thing is happening. But if it's going to take them a couple of hours maybe to get down to the city from where they are, maybe the march is happening at the exact same time and just everyone comes together at the same time.
Yeah.
And then I suppose the rest of the police force is coming together, the task force, which probably explains the cover with the whole idea of like, there's basically every faction in the city on the cover. Which makes the presidential race feel like the kind of odd plot out, in that we're going to have to deal with a lot of the immediate action stuff happening, which leaves very little time to have any sort of a like political back and forth between Zhu Li and Raikou. But at the same time, I don't really feel like we're going to end the book with a new president elected. That sort of feels like we're setting that up to kind of come to a fruition at like a later point, that we still have an election to happen. We still have to, I suppose, properly announce to the entire city that Zhu Li is running, and the campaign's properly jumping into play. So I really don't see a way where we can just immediately end with a resolution to who is the next president, unless they do something where like Raikou like resigns from the race or something like that because of some sort of reveal, and so Zhu Li kind of just gets in by default. But I'm not sure about that. What are your thoughts on how they'll approach the presidential race? Do you think it'll just be left for like the comics after Turf Wars to do, or will they try to commit to having someone as the president by the end of Turf Wars?
I don't know. I mean, I could definitely see them just sort of like the end of it, sort of making it sort of well known that she will become the president, either because of situations with Raikou or just because of how the presidential race is sort of being laid out, or just how Zhu Li, sort of handles this whole sort of situation. I could definitely see things sort of being in her favor. I mean, it definitely seems like how they're going about it, that it definitely is, even though it seemed like it might almost be sort of like a main plot sort of in the middle of this book, it seems like with all the sort of action and Tortuga sort of, just being such a threat towards the city, that's, and based off of the cover, like you said, it definitely seems like that's going to be one of the more sort of important plot points, unless they do something where this sort of situation itself is sort of handled like somewhere by like midway through the next book. Which, if they do it that quickly, and if that is a good resolution, assuming they go that route, then I guess that would leave them more times to do to deal with either the presidential race or with sort of the spiritual sort of crisis that they're having in the city in general, and maybe that's something that they can focus off with that, with the extra pages that they have that. But it definitely does seem like, regardless of whichever, I guess, sort of thread they try to focus on, that it doesn't seem like it's something that's going to be sort of, resolved just in, the next book. Like maybe the whole battle part will be, but, there'll still be like the city's not going to be perfectly recovered. I mean, I don't think they're going to cover, Zhu Li said that it would take like, a couple months to sort of build the whole buildings and everything. Like I can't see, the whole next book unless they do some sort of time. Nah, that wouldn't even make any sense if they did a time skip or anything like that. Unless they did a time skip at the end of the book to Zhu Li sort of winning the presidential race or something like that. Maybe they could do something like that. But I definitely don't see them covering just that much span of time in one book.
Hmm. Yeah, and I'm looking at the cover for part 3 here, and I'm noticing the kind of green orb on the spear portal. Which usually, when we've seen that, it's some sort of a kind of like lock type thing. So it kind of feels like, are they maybe suggesting that she might be forced to or consider closing the central spear portal or something like that? With that, if not, then I feel that Korra using like spirit bending at some point in the book to do something will probably come into play. In that, that to me feels like how she may have to eventually defeat Tokuga by spirit bending him, because I'd really like to know if like spirit bending would cure him of the being a half spirit, like if that would just get rid of the tentacle stuff and turn him back to normal, or if it would, like maybe other characters, result in his death or whatever. That's kind of what I want to know in that. Like it's cool that the preview page basically says coming in June 2018, the final showdown at the Spirit Portal. I'm glad that we're at least right there at the bridge between the spirit world and the physical world, in that it gives him a more obvious reason for the spirits to be involved. Because for me, that's where like the only real, I suppose, excitement heading into part 3 is to see where they go with that, how they'll really involve the spirits. I hope it's not just as another kind of like, oh, mindless army against Korra type thing and she'll turn them good again. I hope they actually, once I suppose she defeats Tokuga and they turn light again, they talk to her, or they talk to a bunch of humans, and they have some sort of a discussion after the events that have happened. That's what I want to see, because I felt like that was like the big talking point after the end of the show, that was one of the big things that Korra still had to tackle. That her leaving the portals open and bringing humans and spirits back together was like the big goal that she has to tackle as the Avatar. The one thing that the Avatar has never able to be like truly be resolved until Korra seems to have at least an opportunity to tackle it here. So that's what I'm excited for here. Not that I don't like any of the other plots. It's just, Sami being kidnapped, Tokuga's plot for power, the presidential race, the Airbender March. It's all fine, but none of it really just gets me like, oh, I need part 3 right now. What does make me kind of want part 3 right now is to see where they go with the spirits, because that, to me at least, feels like something new and interesting we haven't seen before, and has kind of impact on like the entire Avatar world if we learn more about the spirits. But what are you most excited for part 3?
I mean, I mean, I guess the spirits part is really interesting just because you get to see the relationships that, hopefully will sort of, I guess, sort of lead the future of Republic City. But I guess just the future of Republic City, in general, I think is pretty interesting just to see how, the city is developing after everything. I mean, even if that's with or without the spirits, or just, seeing how, if Zhu Li becomes the president, how that actually sort of plays out. And with our sort of characters sort of being involved in the city, I think that's, I don't know, I always sort of like the character interactions, that and sort of just the main plots that they have with the whole spirit portal, I think would be pretty cool to sort of see how they have that laid out, and just, the relationships and that sort of dynamic that they have. I mean, just seeing, Mako and how he sort of, comes to term with the whole relationship, and I guess sort of any other characters that haven't, found out about their relationship, or just, seeing how that all plays out, I think will be cool as well. But, I think for what they have setting up right now, it's definitely sort of, just dealing with Tortuga, and just sort of the spirits in general should be probably, I would guess, be the main sort of focuses of the next book.
Yeah, and then I suppose after Turf Wars, the hope would be that we tackle some of the more meaningful topics at play here, and that there's always the want to go to the Fire Nation and see what it's like in kind of Korra period time, meet some of the characters we haven't met before, put some of those potentially kind of drop plot points that we maybe heard about little bits and pieces of back into play. Just because, at least for me, it being so Republic City focused is just like, it feels like it's always kind of the same plot points of just like, okay, triads, kind of politics, bender, non-bender, inequality. It's just like, this is what Republic City is at this point. I kind of want to see a little bit of kind of classic kind of Avatar, Korra, traveling kind of come back into things after this, because I hope we're not locked down into just every book takes place in Republic City and it's always a threat on the city. And while I like, some of the politics we're dealing with here, if we go too many books in a row where like that's the core focus of it, I don't know how interesting that will be, because that's kind of the same problem they're tackling with right now in Avatar comics, and that how interesting is it if just every single book is just really, really slow progress towards the nations just kind of getting back together, and it's these business deals and deals between nations to start trading with other nations. It's kind of like cool as like a grander scheme thing, but what about the plots that relate to the characters that we care about, and I suppose the stuff the fans really want to see? That's where I think there's a lot of pressure on when they announce the next Avatar comic. I assume it will have to be in the next couple of months, because if that's just another somewhat mundane, here's like the Fire Nation showing them how they're incorporating back more into things, I'm not sure how big of an impact that is compared to the potential of what we have to deal with in the Avatar world. But I suppose, yeah, we still have a long time to go until part 3. We have to wait until June, and even then, potentially, we may be experiencing another delay, because I know some people have been posting about how Amazon have put back their dates for the book. The comic date, as far as I'm aware, as of yet, hasn't been changed, but it looks like potentially there could be some sort of a delay by like a month or so on Amazon with part 3, but we'll have to see how that plays out. But I suppose for you, just as an overall thing with the comics, do you think they need to, really get some sort of a story going where like it's a bit more of an impactful story? It's more like The Search, more like the Rift, where there's, I think, investment from the fans in it, and not just like, oh, it's cool Triad stuff and that sort of stuff going on.
I don't know. I mean, I think that definitely would help as far as like the fan base goes, as far as, having stories that are, I guess just some, some questions, I guess, just from the holdout of the original series, which I guess, is always like one of those things, if you really want to make the series so sort of fan base, or like something that's already sort of pre-existing, rather than sort of developing the story further, which I guess working on Republic City is furthering the city. That is where the most of it is, but it's just the fact that the Avatar world is pretty big. There is such a history and a lore to it, that there are so many, I guess sort of different things that they could explore. I mean, yeah, I could definitely see them. I mean, dealing, at least one more, I guess, sort of series with Republic City, but it would definitely have to be something really interesting, and I would definitely hope that they would mix it with some more just general sort of exploring of the world. I mean, Republic City, like any sort of city, is always going to have its share of, I guess, sort of troubles and issues that's going on. But I don't know. I could think they definitely could, help with expanding farther out. I think that would definitely, help, I guess, just sort of have, more sort of interest in sort of the core sort of comics in general. I mean, the whole Korrasami relationship is definitely really cool, and it's definitely something that'll get, people invested in it, but the series could, have that and do a lot more with it. So I don't know.
Yeah, because I think the problem with this book has been that obviously I think the different release dates is becoming a bigger and bigger problem over time. I still to this day don't get why the digital release is not with the comic store release date, and why they wait until digital and like Amazon bookstore release dates. That's when it all happens, which is in 2 days' time. That obviously doesn't help at all with the initial release of the book. But still, like it's been nearly 2 weeks since the book's been out in comic book stores, and I honestly haven't seen a lot of people discussing like the book. And what I mean by that is that there's been a lot of people talking about the book, but most of what I've seen is only people talking about the Korrasami scenes, and there's really only like two and a bit in this like entire book. And I think it speaks to the fact that a lot of the excitement around Turf Wars is very much based in like the Korrasami fandom, and beyond that, the just general Avatar fans aren't as invested. Like if you don't treat Korrasami as being like the most amazing thing in the world, you're not getting a ton out of this book in terms of what you really want. And obviously this adds on to the idea of like we've always been talking about for like years now, that they need to kind of accelerate the releases of these books, have multiple books ongoing at the same time, and especially with Turf Wars taking even longer between parts to come out, it creates a situation where like barely anyone's talking about this book. I've outside of like I think one or two people reviewing the full book, I think this is one of the first times on this podcast where I've really seen people talk about the other plot points in the book, of like the Triad plot points, Tokuga as a character, and so on. Everything else has just been like the Korrasami fan base, as far as I've been concerned, in that there's just hasn't been the level of I suppose interaction with this book as previously. In that I'm pretty sure like Avatar Spirit, which is like the most popular Avatar forum out there, not a single person has posted in one of their Turf Wars Part 2 discussion threads. But at least the last time I looked, it was just the initial opening post from the moderator on that site, and there's been no interaction in it up to now. And that potentially speaks to a problem of just that they haven't done a great job recently with the comics of really doing anything to get the fandom talking all that much. But have you seen any reaction from the rest of the fan base to Turf Wars Part 2?
No, I mean, I have seen some. I mean, I've seen, some reactions on Reddit on a couple of different threads. I've seen, some fan art of, various characters. There was one of the new character Jargala that was interesting. Yeah, no, I haven't seen, I guess, sort of a huge amount of talk, but I mean, it's also part of it's just sort of the whole sort of delay aspect. I mean, we always sort of make note of that, just the fact that the sort of e-copy sort of version doesn't come out for another couple days or so really sort of, leads to, only people who are really sort of able and invested in actually sort of getting the physical copy to actually be able to even read it and sort of review it. So there's always going to be sort of that delay there between people actually sort of getting it, and some people, after initial people sort of get it and sort of review it, they may not even sort of choose to get it at that point. So it's one of those things that's sort of hard to judge.
Yeah, that's why like I really feel they need to they need to make it so that we're not just waiting for one series always at a time. That the sooner we get an Avatar and a Korra series coming out at roughly the same time in a year, the better, because I think we absolutely need that. Because the thing is, like, the next book isn't out until June. Like, Turf Wars Part 3 is what we're waiting for, and that's 6 months from now, basically, if there is another delay involved. And imagine how that would be so much different if the first Avatar comic was coming out in April, and we had Korra, Avatar, back and forth. It'd be much more exciting, because I think we've been saying it for like years now. It's just these books get discussed for like a week, and then it's just silence until like the preview pages, or sometimes the preview pages don't come out until like days before the book is out. It's, at least 4 to 6 months between discussions on these books, and that's where they need to, I think, really try to get the fandom back invested, and that's by, I think, primarily just telling stories that people want. So hopefully that's something they improve on as we go forward. But I suppose we'll finish with some final thoughts on part 2 of Turf Wars. For me, like, discussing it here, definitely, I can see, like, there's a few more kind of character interactions that are actually quite well done, but I still feel that fundamentally the book is just a little dull overall. Not that it's boring or anything like that, it's just, as I said at the start, nothing particularly exciting just yet, in that it is just a lot of Republic City kind of politics, kind of issues within the city stuff happening. They're trying to present some character arcs for certain characters, but I don't feel they're being as clear as they perhaps should be. The villain is, a little bit kind of basic, with just him wanting power. It's fine, like, it's not bad, I don't think. I think it's definitely harsh to just call the book bad, but it just, I don't think, has enough strengths. There's very little in this book that I think I'd like freak out to someone and go like, you have to read Turf Wars Part 2 because of this scene or this plot point. You have to read it. In the same way that, like, as much as I feel like North and South, most of the parts of North and South were similar to this in that there's not a lot of excitement, I'd actually go out of my way to say, like, no, get North and South Part 2, because that Hakoda, Katara, and Aang scene is so good. I think you need to get it, and I think it's just missing some of those kind of really standout moments. It's fine. I just hope we improve from here as Korra Comics continues. So that's my kind of general thoughts on the book. I hope Part 3 delivers some excitement. But Greg, what are your final thoughts on Turf Wars Part 2?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess, I think it is a good book. I think it definitely does a good job of sort of continuing on from where they left off in part 1, and it sort of continues the different threads. And I don't know, I think, I definitely can see how it might not be sort of the most sort of like exciting book out of, like, the ones that we've gotten so far, but I think it's definitely, it definitely helps to keep sort of what the ideas of what they're actually going for. And I like that it does sort of at least begin to sort of explain, sort of Tortuga's deal, even if it isn't sort of like, he's definitely not the most sort of like exciting sort of like bad guy that we've ever had, with like, questioning sort of morals, or some point where you can sort of like see that maybe he might have sort of a reason behind what he's doing. He's definitely more of your, straight up sort of baddie type guy. He just has this interesting sort of aspect that he's split with a spirit, which, does make it more interesting, rather than him just being like your normal sort of, taking over sort of the city type of character. So they do have that sort of going for it. But yeah, it's definitely something where, I'm definitely looking more forward towards how it's, going to be concluded, rather than just everything that sort of has happened in this book.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose one thing we maybe should mention here is just how different Part 2 is to Part 1, because Part 1 obviously spent so much of its page count kind of exploring, like how the Avatar world views like same-sex relationships, and Korrasami was such a huge part of Part 1, and it just felt like, yes, there were Korrasami scenes, but it wasn't so much, really dealing with that as a topic, in that it was just scenes of two characters in a relationship, rather than anything being overly focused on, which I'm actually okay with, because I'd prefer they just kind of, most characters just be perfectly okay with these type of relationships, and we just kind of move along, that like, okay, we know how the world in general views these things, and it's normal, because I don't know how well received if they kind of leaned into some sort of an arc or a plot relating to characters having issues with same-sex relationships would actually be. So I'm actually okay with them, just just continuing on as if it's just a relationship. It's fine. Whereas I know some people were talking about that it's a big shift from just Korrasami being like almost everything that part one was to only being a couple of scenes here. But do you have any thoughts on how different part one and two are in that way?
Yeah, no, I mean, they definitely just set it up as like a normal sort of relationship here, which I think, I guess, with getting the whole sort of explanation of how the world views it, which was, sort of the focus of the first one, that, it really can just sort of be a couple here, and we can sort of see, their dynamic together, which I think is probably the more sort of interesting part of it in general, just seeing how, they work together as a couple, and how they, deal with different issues and deal with the struggles of just, being in a relationship in itself, which is, something to behold just on its own sort of facts. So I think it's definitely, cool that that's sort of how they're taking it now. I mean, I know, some people want that to be more sort of focus, but, I think they do, they have it in here. So it's not like they're trying to sort of like sweep it under the rug or anything. It's definitely here. So you definitely can see, how it will, sort of play out later on. So it's definitely, I mean, the whole fact that she's being, captured at the end, has such a great effect on Korra, and is sort of why she can't, why she feels like everything is her fault. So it's definitely a element to the story.
So yeah, that's our initial review for Turf Wars Part 2. We will probably be talking about it more on the podcast next week, and hopefully we can get Kelly and Harrison on to give their thoughts on the book as well. As well as that, like, the next podcast will be after the book has seen its, I suppose, official like mass market release. So we'll probably be able to discuss more of the overall fandom's reaction to the book as well, as well as covering any sort of news that happens between then and now. So yeah, that's been the podcast for this week. It's been myself and Greg. So thanks for listening to this podcast, and bye.
Bye bye.